Why does a neighborhood patrol officer need combat boots and night vision goggles? That's the question that kept looping in my head the third time Greg marched into our yard like he was about to lead a SWAT raid, acting like my grandfather was smuggling something illegal under the rose bushes. No knock, no call. Just straight in, like he was deployed in a war zone. I've tried to be understanding, really I have, but when someone trespasses 3 nights in a row and still insists you're the problem, patience snaps. And this time, Grandpa wasn't the only one paying attention. Tell me in the comments, am I wrong for thinking this is straight-up harassment? You know that feeling when you finally get to breathe in your own backyard after a day full of endless client calls and design revisions? That was me last Tuesday, about 4:30 in the afternoon, standing with the green garden hose watering my tomatoes and, for the first time all day, actually feeling human again. The sunlight hit the spray just right, throwing tiny rainbows into the air. For a second I thought maybe I figured something out in this messy world. As an interior designer, I spend most of my time making other people's homes look beautiful. But stepping into my own little refuge always reminds me why I love what I do. A warm breeze carried the scent of honeysuckle from next door. Birds were running through their evening chorus in the tall oak trees. It was the kind of suburban peace that almost makes you forget the world outside is chaos. Meanwhile, Grandpa Frank was stationed at his command post, his weathered wooden chair on the front porch, conducting his daily surveillance routine. At 75, he's turned neighborhood watching into a full-on hobby, complete with his ceramic coffee mug that somehow never runs dry, and his glasses sliding down his nose like he's reviewing top-secret files, instead of tracking misses. Peterson walking her poodle. Frank's been with us for 2 years now, ever since Grandma passed, and honestly, having a retired military man as your unofficial neighborhood watch captain is usually pretty comforting. He knows every sound on the street, can tell which delivery truck is which neighbor's kids snuck out over the weekend, and somehow always calls it when the mail carrier's running behind. That calm Tuesday vibe shattered when I heard voices approaching our iron gate. Sharp, businesslike voices that definitely weren't the friendly neighbor type. My shoulders tightened. I turned off the hose and headed out front to see what was going on. Standing there was Paula Clark. In her navy blazer she treats like a suit of armor, her HOA president pin gleaming like a badge of absolute authority over everyone's daily lives. Beside her was Greg Dalton, clipboard in hand, combat boots on his feet. They looked absurdly tactical for people supposedly enforcing lawn rules. He studied our yard through the iron bars like he was mapping out an operation. Paula spoke with that sickly sweet tone that makes your skin crawl, announcing they needed immediate access to inspect alleged tree violations, citing some resolution supposedly passed at last week's emergency board meeting. Still holding the hose, I walked up and politely asked to see the court order or legal permit that gave them the right to enter private property without permission. Paula's fake smile vanished instantly. She glanced at Greg and gave him what looked like a signal. A signal? Seriously, who practices hand gestures for HOA enforcement unless they're planning something way past normal neighborhood business? Greg stepped forward and started climbing our 6-foot iron fence like he was in military training. His heavy boots dug into the scrollwork while Paula stood by, watching like this was standard HOA procedure. I squeezed the hose so tight the water hissed out, perfectly matching my mood as I watched a uniformed stranger force his way into our space. From the porch, Grandpa Frank delivered his commentary with deadpan precision. "Son, I don't recall our fence offering mountain climbing services to the public." Greg ignored every protest and dropped into our backyard with a thud that rattled the flower beds. Immediately, he started scribbling on his clipboard, snapping photos of perfectly ordinary landscaping from strange angles designed to make everything look suspicious. The worst part? Watching him pull out chalk and scrawl symbols across our patio. Stones, markings that looked less like inspection notes and more like some archaeological dig. When I demanded to know what he thought he was doing with his unauthorized chalk graffiti, Greg didn't even look up, just kept scratching notes on that clipboard, like I wasn't even there. The entire ordeal felt surreal, like being trapped in a fever dream where strangers in official-looking uniforms could suddenly decide your private property was theirs to examine whenever they pleased. One man, dressed in military-style boots, was literally scribbling across my patio while his supervisor stood confidently outside the gate, projecting ownership over every inch of the neighborhood. I kept convincing myself there had to be a logical explanation, some clerical mix-up that rational adults could work through with simple conversation and mutual respect. Instead, Greg carried on with his show, snapping photos of our garden tools, measuring arbitrary distances between perfectly healthy plants, and jotting down figures that didn't match a single homeowners association rule I'd seen in the 3 years we'd lived here. Meanwhile, Frank sat motionless on the porch. Coffee. Mug balanced on the armrest, his eyes locked on Greg's every move. His silence was unnerving. It felt less like casual observation and more like he was mentally archiving every detail for later use. When I finally told Greg he needed to leave immediately, he looked up from his clipboard with a smug grin and informed me the inspection wasn't finished under current HOA enforcement procedures. From the gate, Paula chimed in with her own reminder: association regulations outrank individual property rights inside the community. I just stood there, probably looking foolish as these people treated our home like they had more legitimate claim to it than the ones paying the mortgage and taxes. After nearly 20 minutes of this circus, Greg finally climbed back over the fence, leaving behind white chalk marks scattered across the patio, like primitive territorial symbols from some tribe claiming new hunting grounds. Paula neatly gathered her documents, Greg dusted off his boots, adjusted his clipboard, and together they strolled away, whispering in tones too low to catch. Their body language left no doubt they believed their mission had been accomplished. Sun still shone, birds resumed singing in the oaks, but the peaceful feeling of home had been shattered by their intrusion. Frank waited until they disappeared around the corner before offering his quiet judgment. Something was off. This felt like only the beginning of something worse. 3 days later, the envelope arrived in our mailbox like a financial landmine, designed to ruin my morning before I'd even dressed for work. Heavy stock paper with the HOA letterhead, my name printed in that cold, bureaucratic font meant to intimidate, the association's logo glaring at me, somehow looking official and threatening at the same time depending on the light, standing. There in my bathrobe, holding a few sheets of paper that felt far heavier than they should, I dreaded what fresh nightmare Paula had orchestrated after Greg's unauthorized inspection. The violation list read like satire, as if maintaining our yard properly had somehow become criminal. Shrubs allegedly too tall by 2 inches, grass uneven in 3 specific areas, gate paint supposedly fading below community standards. Each accusation came with detailed measurements taken. At times I knew we weren't even home, paired, with photographs shot from angles designed to make our yard look like a disaster zone. The codes cited referenced HOA rules I'd never once heard discussed in all our years at community meetings, but the number at the bottom made my coffee cup freeze in midair. $2,000. 2,000 actual dollars for caring for my property, the EO. Same way I had since moving in, without a single neighbor ever complaining. I reread the number 4 times, convinced my eyes were lying, but no. Paula Clark really believed our bushes justified a $2,000 fine. I stumbled back inside, gut-punched and robbed all at once. Frank sat at the kitchen table, newspaper spread in front of him like he was analyzing intelligence briefings. One look at my face, and he asked what fresh punishment Paula had devised. When I handed him the letter, he scanned it with the calm precision of someone reviewing military reports, not HOA nonsense. He nodded once, like he'd been expecting this escalation. "We need cameras," he said firmly, not a suggestion, an order. That same afternoon, I drove to the electronics store and dropped $300 on a doorbell camera system with HD video, crystal clear. Audio and motion-activated lights programmed for day or night. It felt absurd to install high-grade surveillance for suburban HOA squabbles, but my paranoia proved warranted, because 2 days later, Greg was back. This time he'd swapped his patrol getup for a convincing utility company disguise, logo patches, tool belt, clipboard, even what looked like authentic electrical testing. Gear He approached the gate with the swagger of someone performing routine maintenance, banking on homeowners being too uninformed to question public utility access. From the new camera feed, I watched him position himself near the electrical meter, clearly preparing to climb the fence the same way he had before. The motion sensors triggered, flooding the area with LED light. Greg hesitated for a second under the sudden spotlight, then continued his act. I opened the door and demanded his company ID and a valid work order before he touched anything connected to the house. He flashed a plastic badge from a distance, but even through the zoom it was obvious, a flimsy, poorly printed fake with peeling ink and crooked edges. It had that unmistakable made-at-home look you can spot from 50 feet away. Still, Greg carried on, pretending that questioning. His credentials was unreasonable interference with urgent public safety work that supposedly couldn't wait. The motion sensor light stayed on, flooding the area with a strange artificial daylight that exposed Greg mid-act, deliberately scattering bits of trash around the garbage pickup spot. Then, without hesitation, he began snapping photos of the scene he had just created, carefully framing each shot so it looked like undeniable evidence of repeated waste violations instead of a staged setup he'd orchestrated seconds earlier. I sat frozen, watching the entire performance unfold on our doorbell camera, my jaw dropping further with each calculated step in his little production of evidence. By morning, another envelope appeared in our mailbox. This one was even worse, a thick stack of fabricated charges designed to squeeze more money out of us. Improper trash disposal, unsafe electrical wiring, poor sanitation standards, utility access issues. Every accusation was backed by photos that clearly showed the exact garbage Greg had planted while dressed like a utility worker, but the timestamps told an impossible story, claiming the pictures had been taken before he ever arrived. Proof right there of intentional fraud. I carried both notices out to Frank, who had stationed himself back on the porch, calmly sipping his morning coffee like it was another surveillance shift from his old military days. He studied the papers with the same precision he once used to analyze enemy intelligence. Minutes passed in silence until he finally looked up, his expression a mix of mild amusement and something sharper, something dangerous. "Next time the gate will know how to defend itself," he said in that steady voice of his, the kind that always meant he was working on a plan nobody else would see coming. There was something different in his eyes as he handed the papers back. A razor-sharp focus that reminded me his problem-solving experience came from battlefields, not neighborhood disputes. I wasn't sure if I should be relieved he had a plan or afraid of what a 75-year-old veteran might consider an appropriate response to people threatening his family's security. There I stood on the porch, holding $4,000 worth of bogus fines while Frank drank coffee as casually as if we were planning a barbecue. One question circled endlessly in my mind. What game is Paula really playing? Those envelopes kept multiplying like some bureaucratic disease spreading across my kitchen. Counter until $4,000 in official-looking demands sat stacked in front of me. Every morning, coffee became a ritual of staring at that pile, my chest tightening with the thought that ordinary families like ours weren't meant to survive extortion disguised as neighborhood rules. That's when Frank suggested we stop reacting and start learning exactly what legal rights we had. I threw myself into research, combing through city ordinances, state property statutes, and even federal laws on residential trespassing. What I found shocked me. Homeowners had far more protection than Paula wanted us to believe. Entry without court approval was trespassing. Marking property with chalk, legally vandalism. Taking unauthorized photos on residential land violated privacy laws that could carry criminal penalties. Paula wasn't enforcing rules, she was breaking them. I printed every page, building a legal defense folder thick enough to block a bullet. Meanwhile, Frank grew strangely secretive, vanishing into the garage for hours at a time. Through the window, I'd see him hunched over workbenches, surrounded by wires, meters, and equipment that looked more military-grade than DIY. He never said a word about it. His habit was always to keep operational details hidden until the final stage. Then, Tuesday's mail arrived. I knew something was different the second I touched the envelope. Heavy stock, embossed letterhead, official language that turned my stomach before I finished the first sentence. Paula had escalated. No longer just fines. This was a lien notice. Pay $4,000 within 1 day or lose the house. Not weeks, not months. 24 hours. I dropped into a chair, numb, as if someone had just handed me a death sentence. Frank read the notice silently, his posture hardening into the combat readiness I'd heard about in family stories. Finally, in a voice low but sharp as steel, he said, "This woman thinks she can steal our house." And in that tone I recognized the man who'd spent decades teaching others that threatening his family was a fatal mistake. That afternoon, everything shifted. Mrs. Henderson from Oak Street appeared at our door with a manila folder and the haunted look of someone carrying secrets too heavy for too long. She explained that Paula had run the exact same scheme against her family 18 months earlier. Manufactured violations, escalating fines, then foreclosure at a fraction of market value. The folder held proof, documents, timelines, evidence. And it wasn't just her. 5 other families had already lost their homes in the same way, with Paula somehow ending up the buyer each time. The realization that we were just the latest targets in a well-rehearsed property theft system made me sick. Frank, though, seemed almost satisfied, as if the missing piece of his puzzle had finally clicked into place. He pointed out the identical strategies in our notices compared to hers, the speed, the fake urgency, the mirrored tactics. Paula wasn't. Obsessed with HOA rules, she was running an organized scam to steal homes. Mrs. Henderson warned us. If money pressure failed, Paula's team would turn to intimidation. Greg's trespassing was just the first step. Harassment designed to make residents feel unsafe until they surrendered. That warning rang louder in my head when I thought about Frank's secret garage projects. Then late Thursday night at 11:15, Greg called. His voice was smug as he announced a surprise inspection scheduled for the next evening. I told him inspections required notice and authorization. He laughed. "Emergencies don't need warnings," he said before hanging up. When I turned, Frank was already in the hallway, fully dressed despite the hour, carrying professional video gear and folders marked with legal terms I didn't even recognize. "Time to see what Paula and Greg really think they're capable of," he said with that same quiet intensity. And that's when I realized tomorrow wouldn't be like any of their earlier visits. I stared at Frank clutching camera equipment in one hand and mystery folders in the other, and wondered if I should be relieved that we'd finally catch them in the act, or terrified of whatever kind of trap my grandfather had been building. In the garage all week, I couldn't tell if this would end in justice or disaster. 3 o'clock in the morning is not exactly when normal people conduct official property inspections, but Paula Clark apparently operates under her own strange set of rules. I was half asleep, listening to a neighborhood that seemed unusually busy for such an early hour when my phone began buzzing with motion alerts from our doorbell camera, loud and insistent like a swarm of angry electronic bees. The timestamp read 3:07 a.m., and the infrared feed displayed 2 figures approaching our gate with tactical flashlights and gear bags, far too professional-looking to be anything related to routine HOA matters. Paula was dressed in what looked like a legitimate police uniform, badge, belt, and radio included, the kind of outfit convincing enough to fool most people during the day, let alone in pre-dawn darkness when details blur. Greg had coordinated his look, also in law enforcement gear, armed with handcuffs, pepper spray, and paperwork that probably originated from Paula's home printer, fake warrants or seizure notices designed to look real. They walked toward our property with the confidence of people who had pulled this off before, fully expecting residents to comply out of fear of police authority. Frank, however, was already awake and stationed at the living room window with professional grade video equipment that made our doorbell camera look like a toy. He had been anticipating this escalation for weeks. What I had mistaken for home security upgrades had in fact been strategic preparations. On the feed, Greg was holding industrial wire cutters instead of his usual clipboard, clearly planning to cut through our systems this time rather than simply climb over the gate like in past visits. Multiple camera angles caught him moving toward the warning signs Frank had installed, positioning the cutters near what he believed were basic security lighting wires. Meanwhile, Paula stayed outside the gate, signaling Greg with hand motions as though they were running a military operation instead of their ongoing campaign of neighborhood harassment. Their imitation radios even crackled with fake dispatch, chatter crafted to make the act seem official to any bystander. Confidently, Greg reached toward the gate's mechanism, convinced that cutting a few circuits would grant him full access for whatever fabricated evidence Paula planned to plant that night. But Frank's electrical modifications had been waiting for exactly this move. The instant Greg's cutters touched the gate, a blinding flash lit up the yard like a sudden bolt of lightning, followed by Greg's panicked scream loud enough to wake half the neighborhood. The cutters flew from his grip into our flower bed as he staggered backward, clearly realizing that our gate now carried far more bite than before. Paula began yelling threats about suing us for assault with a deadly weapon, but her voice betrayed panic as neighbors' porch lights flicked on in response to Greg's outburst. Frank calmly stepped outside with his video camera, wearing the satisfied look of someone whose careful plans had played out flawlessly. "This footage shows everything," he said evenly. "Trespassing, impersonating officers, destroying private property, tampering with security systems." Meanwhile, the doorbell camera automatically uploaded everything to the cloud and pinged local law enforcement. That meant actual police were already on their way to determine whose uniforms were authentic. From the doorway, I watched Paula's confidence collapse as she realized Frank had anticipated their scheme. Greg was still clutching his hands and muttering about electrical burns while Paula frantically gathered their imitation gear, clearly desperate to retreat before the real officers arrived. The irony was almost poetic. People pretending to be cops, now terrified of actual police catching them red-handed in stolen authority. Within minutes, blue and red lights lit up the end of the street. Frank had contacted authorities earlier, not afterward, ensuring a swift response. 2 patrol cars rolled up with professional precision, while Paula and Greg tried to melt into the shadows near the community mailboxes, banking on their costumes to pass as genuine. But Frank's documentation left no room for doubt. Detailed reports of harassment, full records of past trespassing, and now high-quality video of tonight's attempted break-in. The responding officers immediately spotted their uniforms for what they were, cheap replicas from a store, not official issue from any real department. Greg was in handcuffs within 5 minutes. His phony badge and gear were seized as evidence of impersonating law enforcement, while Paula tried to insist that sometimes neighborhood association business needed an official look to command. Respect, that excuse collapsed quickly once officers uncovered wire cutters, a fake dispatch radio, and forged papers claiming authority to carry out pre-dawn property inspections. Watching Greg shoved into the back of a squad car while Paula frantically dialed lawyers felt like long overdue justice after weeks of harassment and financial intimidation. Frank stood on our porch with his coffee, looking entirely unfazed, like he was watching a rerun of a movie he'd seen too many times. The whole situation felt unreal. People who had been threatening our safety and home security were suddenly facing real accountability instead of hiding behind counterfeit authority. But Paula's face as the car pulled away didn't show guilt or defeat. It was calculation, a cold, measured rage, like someone who had lost a round but was already plotting the next. She lingered in our driveway after the police left, glaring at our electrified gate and Frank's smug smile with the kind of intensity that screamed revenge, not surrender. I couldn't shake the dread that Greg's arrest had only made Paula more determined to destroy us. Once the patrol cars vanished, the neighborhood slipped back into its eerie 3 a.m. quiet. But something fundamental had shifted. We weren't just targets anymore. We were now active players in whatever war Paula was waging against homeowners who refused to roll over. Frank's electrical setup had worked flawlessly, but instead of triumph, I felt a heavy unease about what kind of counterattack Paula might unleash. This had escalated past petty harassment. Now it was federal crimes and real arrests. Standing in the doorway, I watched Frank sip his coffee as calmly as if orchestrating the takedown of fake cops was just his usual Tuesday night pastime. But I couldn't shake the sense that we had crossed a line that would make everything far more dangerous. Maybe I had pushed too hard this time. Greg only spent 24 hours in county jail before Paula's lawyer secured his release. which said everything about how much money she was willing to burn, shielding their property theft scheme from consequences. Local news even ran a segment about phony police officers busted for trespassing and impersonation. But somehow, Paula twisted the story to paint herself and Greg as victims of a deranged homeowner who had rigged his property with traps to harm innocent community volunteers. In her version, we weren't defending ourselves. We were unhinged vigilantes. She conveniently ignored the wire cutters, forged IDs, and fake radio Greg was caught with at 3 a.m. Her counterstrike began before Greg was even released. She hired a high-priced personal injury attorney who specialized in lawsuits and immediately filed a claim. According to her filing, our electrified gate amounted to assault with a deadly weapon, deliberately intended to harm neighborhood. Representatives carrying out legitimate safety inspections. The suit demanded $50,000 in damages for Greg's supposed injuries, emotional distress from being falsely accused, and punitive damages for what she called our family's pattern of violent resistance to lawful authority. Then Paula went live online, standing in front of our house with a bright pink microphone. She painted us as violent extremists, claiming we had set up death traps to hurt anyone trying to uphold community standards. With crocodile tears and dramatic gestures toward our gate, like it was some medieval torture rack, she turned Greg into a wounded martyr and Frank into a dangerous militant. Her performance was so convincing that dozens of neighbors began believing we posed a genuine threat. Mrs. Halverson wouldn't even wave when she crossed the street. She just clutched her dog tighter and hurried off. Meanwhile, the comment feed on Paula's livestream filled with angry neighbors demanding we be kicked out of the community before someone got hurt. People who had never exchanged a single word with us suddenly declared themselves experts on our character, calling us dangerous and demanding police probe our property modifications. Paula's showmanship had recast our defense as aggression, flipping reality on its head. My phone blew up with calls from furious neighbors I didn't even know, accusing us of turning our house into a booby-trapped fortress. Mrs. Peterson from across the street even left a voicemail saying she was afraid to walk her poodle past our home after hearing Paula's stories about electrical death traps. It was maddening, watching our reputation shredded by the very woman who had been stealing families' homes for years. Frank, meanwhile, stayed remarkably calm through the smear campaign. Every morning he sat on the porch with his coffee, as if nothing unusual was happening. When I asked how he could stay so composed while Paula convinced the whole neighborhood we were criminals, he just smiled and said he still had one last card left to play. The way he said it made me think he had been expecting this exact retaliation and had already prepared for it. The real impact became clear soon enough. Neighbors deliberately avoided our side of the street. Parents pulled their kids away when passing our house. Delivery drivers wouldn't even approach the gate, spooked by Paula's claims of hidden electrical hazards. Paula had managed to cut us off from community support, persuading everyone that by standing up to harassment, we were somehow the real danger to neighborhood peace and safety. I stared at the snapped wires hanging from our doorbell camera. No warnings, no notes, just quiet, deliberate sabotage. Someone had ripped it apart during Paula's live stream performance. The device dangled crookedly, its wires exposed, clear evidence that someone had trespassed while we were distracted by the online smear campaign unfolding in real time. The timing was too perfect to be chance. While Paula staged her performance for the internet, someone took out our main line of security. I grabbed my phone, opened a live streaming app, and began recording. If she wanted to use the crowd to isolate me, I'd use it to reveal the truth. But I was drowning, juggling lawsuits, financial manipulation, and neighborhood politics, while still working full-time and trying to maintain some kind of ordinary life. Frank noticed how dangerously high my stress was climbing. He suggested maybe it was time to stop reacting defensively and start going after the people who clearly weren't going to stop their campaign. My hands trembled as I held the subpoena. I was done being prey. Friday morning, a process server delivered it, summoning me to court to respond to Greg's injury claim. He even looked apologetic, like he knew it was wrong to serve papers to someone who was just defending their home against trespassers. The court date was set for Monday, which meant we had only 3 days to prepare for Paula's $50,000 lawsuit. I sat staring at that document, feeling like David staring down Goliath, except this Goliath had lawyers, fake narratives, and community support, while David had nothing but a fortified gate and a grandfather tinkering with secret projects in the garage. Frank examined the paperwork with his usual meticulous focus, but this time his face showed concern rather than quiet confidence. The weekend blurred into long hours of legal research, organizing evidence, and mounting dread about facing Paula's well-paid attorney. All we had were security camera clips and records of her previous victims. Frank spent most of Saturday in the garage welding together some contraption with metal parts I couldn't identify. When I asked what he was building, he only said it was a backup system in case our main defenses failed. By Sunday evening, he finally revealed what he'd really been working on all those nights. He hadn't just been documenting our harassment, he'd been building a case on Paula's entire operation across different neighborhoods. He had call logs with Mrs. Henderson, financial records from other victims showing shady property transfers, and evidence pointing to crimes far beyond HOA power abuse. Looking at the piles of documents spread across the kitchen table like classified intelligence reports, I realized this was no longer just about protecting our house. This was about exposing Paula, and this time I didn't wait for Frank to lead. I was going to fight her, both in court and on camera. Monday came with the dread of a root canal I'd been avoiding for weeks. The emergency HOA meeting was set for 7 p.m. at the community center, which gave me an entire day to panic about facing 30 households Paula had convinced that we were a threat to their safety. At work, I couldn't focus on design presentations. My mind kept rehearsing arguments against accusations so absurd they shouldn't even exist. I felt every imagined stare like a verdict already cast. My biggest fear wasn't just losing, it was that the neighbors would never see me as anything other than the villain Paula invented. Frank spent the day assembling what he called presentation materials, a laptop, a portable projector, and several thick manila folders full of documents he wouldn't let me see until it was time. His confidence was both reassuring and terrifying, especially since our entire defense against $50,000 in claims hinged on whatever he'd uncovered. The moment we walked into the community center, I felt hostility pressing against us. 30 residents sat in folding chairs, staring as if we were defendants in a criminal trial instead of homeowners standing up to targeted harassment. Paula sat front and center, legal documents spread out neatly before her, dressed in professional attire that made her look respectable, nothing like the person caught impersonating police just days earlier. She waved around doctored paperwork and inflated medical records as if they were gospel. She painted our gate as a deadly trap and Frank as an extremist. She paraded oversized photos of our electrified gate, medical documents of Greg's supposed burns, and even brought in expert testimony from an electrician claiming our setup violated safety codes for emergency responders and volunteers. Her attorney sat beside her, jotting notes, while Paula portrayed us as unstable people whose violent tendencies endangered the entire neighborhood. I tried to speak up, but my voice cracked, too small to cut through the fear filling the room. The neighbors swallowed her story whole. They nodded when she spoke about safety. They gasped at Greg's injury photos. Some even stood, demanding we be expelled before someone was killed by our so-called death traps. I sat frozen as they described us like criminals, while Paula soaked in their outrage like a politician basking in applause. My heart sank. What if facts weren't enough? People don't crave proof. They crave someone to blame. When Paula finished, the room buzzed with heated talk about what to do with us. That's when Frank rose, laptop in hand, and calmly asked to respond. Paula's lawyer objected, saying this wasn't a courtroom and we had no right to present counter-evidence. But Frank was already connecting his projector. The first thing he displayed wasn't gate footage. It was a financial spreadsheet of HOA account activity over the last 3 years. Highlighted entries lit up the screen, making several neighbors shift uneasily in their seats. Instead of replaying incidents they already knew, Frank showed them something worse, exactly where community funds had been vanishing while fees kept rising for services that never came. Paula's confident facade began to crumble when Frank projected documents exposing unauthorized spending, including lavish renovations on her own house. She had billed the HOA's emergency maintenance funds for these upgrades, along with disguising personal vacations as community conferences. The spreadsheet made it undeniable. Over $60,000 of residents' money had been funneled into Paula's pocket, while neighborhood infrastructure projects stalled indefinitely under the excuse of non-existent budget shortages. Then Frank played the next piece of evidence, and Paula's own voice shattered any remaining doubt. The second revelation was a set of recorded phone calls with real estate agents, where she discussed acquisition strategies and timelines aimed at families she had deliberately pushed into financial crisis. These weren't casual chats about buying property. Paula was orchestrating foreclosures and then partnering with buyers to snatch up homes at below-market prices. The room fell into a stunned silence as Paula's voice bragged about her success rate in forcing property transfers. Through HOA enforcement, her tone was unmistakable, mocking families as easy prey who would never stand up to what looked like official legal threats. She even laughed about residents who paid fabricated fines without questioning them, dismissing them as suckers, who deserved to lose their homes for being too naive to recognize fraud. Some residents walked out during the presentation, not because they were angry with Frank, but because they were furious at discovering their HOA president had been stealing from community funds while engineering schemes that could ruin any family present. Paula repeatedly tried to cut Frank off, but every objection only deepened her guilt as it became obvious she was desperate to stop the evidence from being seen. Frank's final slide silenced the room, a notice of federal investigation. Paula's face drained of color as he explained he'd been working with FBI financial crimes agents for weeks, supplying proof of her property theft operation and its ties to similar scams in neighboring communities. The investigation had already widened far beyond their HOA, uncovering a pattern of manufactured violations and forced foreclosures that had funneled millions in real estate into the hands of organized criminals. When Frank announced that federal agents were waiting just outside, Paula attempted to flee, but several residents blocked the exits. They weren't protecting her. They were making sure she couldn't escape accountability for destroying families they knew personally. The mood of the meeting shifted instantly, from suspicion toward us to righteous anger against the person who had betrayed the entire neighborhood under the guise of protecting it. The emergency session ended with unanimous votes to strip Paula of all HOA authority, freeze the association's bank accounts, pending a federal audit, and request law enforcement to investigate any other possible collaborators. Frank packed up his projector with the calm efficiency of someone whose preparation had achieved exactly what he intended. As we walked home, my thoughts were elsewhere, wondering just how far Paula's network extended and how much darker it might truly be. That darkness became undeniable the following Wednesday when Agent Martinez arrived at our door leading a federal task force prepared to carry out coordinated arrests across multiple states. Frank's cooperation with the FBI had given them the final evidence needed to shift from investigation into prosecution. What none of us understood until that morning was just how enormous this conspiracy really was. The agents showed up in those unmistakable black suits that scream serious federal business, but their eagerness slipped through as they explained. We had helped uncover the largest HOA fraud ring in U.S. history. Greg's collapse under federal questioning revealed details so staggering I struggled to wrap my head around the scale of what we had stumbled into. Pushed by seasoned interrogators who specialized in financial crimes, Greg confessed that Paula had drawn him in by promising a 20% cut from every property they managed to seize through fabricated violations, but their scheme extended far beyond families like ours. Paula had been working in tandem with 5 other HOA presidents in different states, pooling tactics and resources to maximize their property takeovers, carefully rotating operations to avoid detection. The financial breakdown Agent Martinez presented was jaw-dropping, and suddenly I understood why federal investigators had devoted 8 full months to bringing this network down. More than $2 million worth of homes had been stripped from innocent families and funneled into criminal hands through false debt claims identical to what Paula had tried on us. Each HOA president looked independent in their communities, but behind the scenes they stayed in constant contact, trading legal tricks, shady lawyers, and foreclosure strategies that gave their victims almost no time to defend themselves. Greg's testimony armed investigators with a full picture: how recruits were chosen, how targets were selected, and how the coordination worked, exposing just how sophisticated Paula's enterprise truly was. They preyed on property owners who were vulnerable, people dealing with life upheavals, financial stress, or who lacked legal knowledge, making them unlikely to fight back effectively. Paula had perfected a system of exploitation disguised as legitimate neighborhood management, and her success rate was chilling. But the revelation that floored everyone in that federal briefing was Martinez's disclosure of Paula's ties to organized crime families who used real estate fraud to wash money from drugs, gambling, and other illegal operations. What began as a neighborhood fight over fence rules and bogus violations turned out to be the surface of a massive iceberg involving racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy, and federal crimes carrying decades-long sentences. Frank's 6 weeks of cooperation with investigators provided the hard evidence needed to launch coordinated arrests across 12 states, dismantling a network that had been operating for more than 4 years. His meticulous financial records, recordings, and documents proved criminal intent beyond any doubt. The FBI had been building simultaneous cases against all 6 HOA presidents, deliberately waiting until the evidence was airtight so no one could tip off their partners. The morning federal agents stormed Paula's house with search warrants still feels surreal months later. At dawn, raids hit 6 locations at once, seizing computers, ledgers, phones, and files that spelled out the collaboration between these HOA leaders. The confidence Paula had flaunted in our community center evaporated when she grasped the magnitude of the charges: racketeering, conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, and direct involvement in organized crime. Her high-priced defense attorneys quickly discovered Frank's evidence was so ironclad that spinning an alternate story was impossible. Recordings of her boasting about seizing properties, bank records showing suspicious cash transfers, and testimony from dozens of victims left her with only one option: plead guilty or risk a sentence that could keep her behind bars for life. Greg, though spared the worst by cooperating with prosecutors, still faced serious prison time. His testimony revealed how Paula lured other HOA presidents at real estate investment seminars, starting with legal strategies but gradually introducing illegal methods that promised much bigger returns through systematic theft disguised as community enforcement. The ripple effects stretched far beyond our neighborhood. Investigations linked similar fraud schemes in 23 states. Families who had lost homes under suspicious circumstances suddenly had their cases reopened as investigators pursued charges against people they once thought were just overzealous board members. What had looked like isolated seizures were actually coordinated attacks by a sophisticated criminal network. Frank's role in dismantling it earned him respect from federal agencies, though he stayed modest, brushing it off as simply applying his military training, recognizing coordinated threats instead of dismissing them as random incidents. The sentencing finally felt like justice after months of helplessness against criminals cloaked in authority. Paula was given 7 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $2.4 million in restitution to families robbed of their homes. Her partners received similar punishments, effectively destroying a scheme that had industrialized property theft. Outside the courthouse, as marshals led Paula away in cuffs while reporters documented the downfall of the largest HOA fraud case in history, I realized just how close my family had come to losing everything to predators who had weaponized the law against us. Now, they were the ones paying the price. That morning, Mr. Vallis waved from his porch for the first time in a year. The silence in our neighborhood had finally been broken. 6 months after Paula's sentencing, our community now runs under strict oversight, transparent finances, yearly elected leaders, and enforcement rules that only apply to real violations, not fabricated ones designed to squeeze out profit. Greg served his sentence. Paula lost it all. The courts called it restitution. I called it justice. Paula Clark was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for racketeering, conspiracy, wire fraud, and money laundering. On top of that, the court ordered her to pay $2.4 million in restitution to the families whose homes had been stolen through her criminal network. Authorities seized her personal property as well, her luxury car, her newly remodeled kitchen, funded with stolen HOA money, and the investment homes she bought with profits from forced foreclosures. Greg Dalton's punishment was lighter, but still severe. He served 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of probation with strict community service requirements totaling 400 hours. He was also permanently banned from ever working in HOA enforcement or property management. Again. His public apology letter was read aloud at a community gathering where he admitted his role in systematic property theft and expressed deep remorse for terrorizing families who only wanted to live peacefully in their homes. But the fallout didn't. And with Paula and Greg, federal investigators uncovered the broader reach of the criminal operation, which stretched across multiple states. 12 other HOA presidents were handed similar prison sentences. Crooked attorneys lost their licenses, and real estate investors who knowingly bought stolen homes were dragged into civil lawsuits, forced to return the properties and pay damages for participating in organized crime. In response, our community adopted strict new HOA regulations to prevent future abuse of authority. Property inspections now require written consent from homeowners. Any violations must be backed by independent verification before penalties can be enforced. And all financial spending must be approved by a majority vote of residents, rather than decided unilaterally by HOA leadership. Frank never ran for leadership. He simply walked into the first community meeting with a notepad and a coffee mug. That alone was enough. He was unanimously elected interim community coordinator. He only accepted on the condition that term limits and democratic oversight would ensure no one person could ever consolidate power again. With his military background and reputation for integrity, neighbors trusted him to set fair rules that protected property rights without stifling reasonable community standards. For my family, the financial toll was completely resolved when the court ordered Paula's organization to cover every legal expense, property repair, and even compensation for the emotional damage caused by their campaign of harassment. We had enough to upgrade our home security, fix the damage Greg caused climbing over fences, and even establish a legal defense fund for any future property rights battles. Families like Mrs. Henderson's, who had lost their homes to Paula's. Schemes received large settlements that allowed them to purchase new homes in better neighborhoods with trustworthy HOAs. Some families even returned to our community after Paula's network was dismantled, reassured that the new leadership would stop such exploitation from ever happening again. What made me breathe easier wasn't the money or even the victory. It was hearing children laugh without fear. Kids could play in their yards again without parents worrying about fabricated violations. Neighbors once more shared friendly conversations across fences, and delivery drivers could approach our homes without worrying about hazards or intimidation from overzealous enforcers. The climate of fear Paula built through manipulation and threats was gone, replaced by genuine cooperation and respect among neighbors. Frank settled back into his usual post on our front porch, but now, instead of keeping watch for trouble, he enjoys watching grandchildren play safely in yards where families no longer dread arbitrary punishments. His coffee mug still rests permanently on the arm of his chair, and neighbors often stop by to talk about community issues, knowing he'll give honest advice rooted in a commitment to protect, not exploit, the people living here. The Electrified gate that first sparked this conflict was reworked into a standard security system with proper warning signs and emergency overrides for responders. Frank still checks the wiring from time to time, grinning at how well his defenses worked against trespassers, but mostly he's satisfied just knowing our family's property is safe. Last weekend, Frank asked if I missed the thrill of fighting criminal organizations. I laughed, telling him I preferred quiet suburban life over federal investigations and endless court hearings. He chuckled back, saying that watching kids play safely in their own neighborhood was far more entertaining than watching adults try to steal houses with phony legal tactics. Standing on the porch, looking out at a neighborhood where families finally felt safe, I realized Frank's military discipline had saved more than just our home. It had safeguarded an entire community from organized exploitation. The gate still hums quietly at night, and sometimes I wonder if it's just electricity or if it's a reminder of what we endured. Maybe that's the real lesson. when you're pushed and made to feel powerless in your own space, standing firm can echo louder than any threat. If you're still with me, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done? And if this story resonated, feel free to hit that little super thanks button to support the channel. Stay sharp, stay grounded, and may your HOA keep its hands out of your yard. That's a wrap from QA Stories, but stick around. There's plenty more drama, twists, and unbelievable stories waiting for you.